Hello, everyone, and welcome to Financing Philadelphia's Future with Councilmember Green. My name's Vanessa Lowe. We have been having these monthly discussions with the public for quite a while now, and they're pretty short. We end it, let's say, we'll end it for at about 5:06 since we're starting now. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to move right along and turn it over to Councilmember Green for just a brief hello, and then we'll get into three big questions, three big issues that we're going to update folks on today. So Councilmember Green, brief hello.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Vanessa, welcome back. Good to hear your voice. You were in the good hands of Susan Wendell in our last conversation, but it's always a pleasure to have both of you with us this afternoon.
Great, great. All right, so we've got some big issues to talk about today in terms of updating from the success that we had in March, which was passing the legislation 15-1. So I understand that we've been through a process now of reviewing applications for the board of directors, that first board that needs to be placed. Tell us a little bit about that.
So I wanted to thank the Philadelphia Public Banking Coalition. They put together a committee to review the various applications of people that applied. Information was provided not only through their website, but also through City Council's website as well. We've received a number of applications. We're at a process now, although the mayor has stated in a letter to me that does not support the funding or does not support the appointments of board members to the Philadelphia Public Finance Authority. I think it's important for us as a group to evaluate the candidates, which the Philadelphia Public Banking Coalition has done. I will do additional review, and I think we need to have a process to get these candidates to the administration because people applied based on the legislation that was passed in March. So I will be reaching out to the council president in order to establish what's the best methodology to present these names to the mayor, and then we'll continue to move forward on next steps in spite of the mayor's opposition.
Okay, and at this point, congratulations on getting applications in. Did we get a full slate of candidates that are ready to be passed on?
Well, we still have some additional needs. I think part of the challenge in the legislation, because of what transpired, we really did not have the full application process that we wanted to. We initially tried to work with the administration and having a website through the city website, and we had a lot of challenges with that. So we had to go the route of having a website through phlcouncil.com. But we're going to continue to move forward in spite of the opposition from the administration, because the legislation was passed in a very strong fashion, and people from around the city support this initiative. And so we're going to move forward in that regard. That's why I will be having a conversation with the council president in reference to the best method to get these names to the administration. And we're going to move forward in spite of the mayor's opposition.
Well, just a public thank you to those who applied and submitted. The legislation was very clear that that specific expertise in various areas was needed, and I understand you got quite good applications, so I'm glad to hear that. Next, let's move to the next big issue, which is transfer ordinance as a possible source for funding the institution. Tell us about that.
So, every year we go through a transfer ordinance process in City Council. We'll pass the budget based on dollars or projections of where we are regarding our fund balance and revenue coming to the city. And historically, that number has not been representative of the actual numbers, and the actual numbers coming in have been higher than what's been projected. And so what happens generally is that there will be a transfer ordinance that happens in the fall, in sometime late September, early October, where funds are transferred from one department to another. Sometimes funds are transferred for initiatives that may have not been funded during the budget process. I've seen that with groups like Adun Day, where Adun Day has been a phenomenal festival in the city of Philadelphia. We were not able to get them funding in the budget process. but we were able to get them funding through the transfer ordinance that we did last year. And so in that same perspective, that's a vehicle that we can use for funding for the authority and working with members of the Appropriations Committee and reaching out to some. And because this legislation was passed almost unanimously, there are members of the Appropriations Committee that support this legislation. I am not a member of the Appropriations Committee, and so that's an avenue that we can take to develop that conversation and dialogue prior to council coming back in session September 15th.
Okay, and again, I wasn't here last month, so I just want to summarize that the budget process is over and nothing
Correct.
was put into the budget for the Philadelphia Financing Authority. So this is essentially an alternative way to get that. Is it still $3 million we're looking for?
Yes, I would still go with a $3 million number because that was based on the research that we did in seeing, when the Philadelphia Energy Authority created the Philadelphia Green Capital Corporation, as well as the Accelerator Fund, which was created by Philadelphia Housing Development Corporation. And we had both of the leaders of those groups come on this show. We put that number together based on that perspective. And because we've had a relationship with the Philadelphia Energy Authority, I've already reached out to that organization to see it as that group can be a vehicle for parking the dollars for the Philadelphia Public Finance Authority until we get the organization up and running with the board and moving forward.
Okay, great. All right, then we've got another big issue, but let me turn to Peter and see if we have any questions from any of the listeners from either Zoom or the Facebook page.
Vanessa, one of the questions that's come up has been the mayor's objection to implementing the law. We usually don't think of Mayor Kenney as a scofflaw, but that's really what he is right now, doing it because he can or thinks he can, I guess. And so I think my question would be, since the reasons for his not appointing a board or funding the authority just don't seem to be accurate. I think they're demonstrably not accurate reasons. What the prospect is for the mayor changing his mind or being induced to change his mind.
So why don't we start with what were his reasons, Councilman, if you could explain
Well,
that.
I mean, his reasons in his letter, and it's unfortunate because we introduced the legislation initially. We had a conversation with the administration about the legislation. We had hearings on the legislation. At no point in time did the administration definitively say, we will oppose this legislation if it becomes law. They kept saying, we have concerns. Well, if you have concerns, why don't you articulate those concerns and we can have a dialogue? Because this process was a very long process because we were doing something fundamentally different, something very creative, something that we had not done here in the city of Philadelphia. And we worked with a number of different partners from outside counsel, Holland and Knight. We were working with the administration in the law department and the treasurer's office that are part of the administration. As well as, we had conversations with Pennsylvania Department of Banking. We had numerous conversations even with those people that raised concerns. But we never had that opportunity to have that conversation. And the administration did not state their opposition at the hearing. The main argument that was made by the mayor in their letter to me, which was subsequent to the letter that I sent in the beginning of June, that it took some time and promptly get a response, was that there are other organizations that can do the same functions as the Philadelphia Public Financial Authority. Well, those other organizations, I would reference to one being like PIDC, Philadelphia Industrial Development Corporation, and they do provide a lot of lending to very small businesses and some of the very businesses that would benefit from the Philadelphia Public Financial Authority. But as a former lender, it does not make sense to have an entity lend money and also provide letter of credit to that same entity. What that does, it creates more risk to that organization that's providing the lending and the letter of credit. And a more prudent lending perspective and financial perspective would be to have one entity provide the loan and a separate entity provides letter of credit. It's like insurance. You have different companies that provide insurance, and those entities sometimes get reinsured. You don't have the same entity that does both perspectives. And so that's why I just think it was unfortunate that we did not have the opportunity to have that conversation or debate or discourse during the hearing process, which we feel is very, at least I feel is very unfortunate. I think others that are interested in this idea would say the same, and we could have had that debate and we could have provided evidence why that perspective is not the most accurate.
Yeah, that is very disappointing. And that's the thing. I know and appreciate all the CDFIs, the community development financial institutions that do exist in the city. There are several, but the fact is that Black and brown businesses are still not getting the capital that they need. And so there's a reason for that. So we need to address that. Go ahead.
And that's one other quick thing. That's not in their business model. You know, your nonprofit lenders, your for-profit lenders, they're in the business of lending. They don't do letters of credit. They don't do these type of guarantees. So we're not trying to duplicate what they do. We're trying to provide a service that was not being met, which goes to your point that too many Black and brown businesses, as well as other hard to lend to entities like cooperatives, some of the new green collar companies are hard to lend to because of the nature of their operations. And so the Philadelphia Public Finance Authority helps to fill that void.
Yeah. Peter, do you have another question? Because I want to go in a slightly different direction before we get to that last big issue.
Just to follow up, Councilman Green, the Philadelphia Public Banking Coalition, after receiving the letter that you received, after reading the letter that you received from Mayor Kenney, wrote an open letter to Mayor Kenney, and he hasn't responded to that. That's sort of, confusing to us, but maybe it's all of the same piece of cloth. The mayor returned the legislation to council without a veto, but without his signature. So he basically has been silent on the issue. If he had vetoed the measure, wouldn't that have been an opportunity to actually have a public debate so that the objections could be examined? Maybe there could be changes made to the legislation so that it would be something that the mayor would support and it could be part of his legacy?
Peter, I totally agree. It was a missed opportunity, and it was a missed opportunity to communicate why you feel there are some concerns and really illustrate that in testimony or in a veto message. But to one, just say I have blanket concerns during the hearing process, then not do a veto message, then not respond to my letter, eventually was prompted to do so later. And the concerns you say are there are already other groups that provide, there are already organizations that can do the same type of work, but they currently do not. And then not respond to a letter from a coalition of constituency organizations is also troubling. And, it makes sense, I would think, to take the letter that was sent to the mayor and do an op-ed, let other people know that the mayor has failed to respond, and that through the letter, the coalition can rebut some of the arguments made by the administration in why the administration is not following through on a legally enacted piece of legislation that will help the citizens of the city of Philadelphia.
Yeah. It's interesting. Was there anything in the letter speaking to the other reason, particularly at the national level, why public banking, I think, has gotten so popular, the issue of the city, essentially not sending their money to Wall Street anymore? Like, let's retain our own money. Let's it work for the city? Did he respond to that? Because that's the thing I'm most excited about.
No, he just focused on the Philadelphia Public Finance Authority. Did not get to issues beyond the authority. As we know on this call, the goal of the authority was to get up and running as a pathway to become a public bank. I think there are probably there's some concerns about that as well. But we drafted legislation the way we did to get through this first step, considering all of the complexities and challenges of trying to create a public bank in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, from collateralization concerns, from issues from the Pennsylvania Department of Banking and Securities, as well as a whole host of other areas. And so we were very deliberate in drafting the legislation the way we did and taking the time doing the research to do it the way we did. And once again, I will just reiterate what others have said. It's unfortunate that a piece of legislation that was supported overwhelmingly by members of City Council, with strong support by citizens and organizations, and in a coalition of those organizations who were advocating for the legislation for some time, that the mayor's response is simply, there are existing groups that can already do this work, even though those groups are not, because that's not their business model.
Right. So it's really not addressing the other goal this is a necessary step to get to that other goal. So yeah, that is very disappointing. All right, well, since we're on that path, let's talk about the last issue, which is there's potential litigation. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, there had been litigation in the past between City Council and administration when legislation has been passed by City Council and the mayor has refused to implement it. And so there's been some discussions about what steps should be taken, both from a possible City Council perspective, but I would also suggest from the coalition, as citizens within the city of Philadelphia who are part of a coalition of organizations and citizens, that there could be a legal strategy in that perspective of legislation being passed and not being implemented. And so I think in that regard, both those in City Council and the public sector who are represented by the city solicitor, who also represents the mayor, can look through what steps can be taken to make sure this legislation is now, not only is it already enacted, but becomes implemented. And I think there could be, and I have not done all the research, but a means for which members of this coalition also take some action in reference to how do we move forward with the implementation of the legislation that was duly passed and enacted into law.
Okay. Peter, any questions? I have one, but it may be one that was covered last month.
Well, the mayor, the legislation's on the books, so the mayor can implement this anytime he wants. But if he doesn't, and if litigation is a long route, wouldn't this be an issue in the upcoming mayoral election for his successor to take the legislation off the shelf and implement it?
Well, litigation as an attorney often takes some time, and I would venture that even if we started some litigation that was started as of yesterday, as of August 1st, it would probably still be a legal matter up through May of 2023, and could possibly still be a legal matter as of January of 2024. So I think it's important for the members of this coalition and organizations that make up the coalition, as well as the individual members, as we're evaluating candidates who are looking to succeed this administration to lead the 100th administration for the city of Philadelphia, to ask those questions regarding legislation that was passed and where they stand on the implementation of that legislation.
Okay. All right, so let's be prepared to ask those questions. But let's break down implementation though. He did not sign, but we don't need a signature. The big issue seems to be the funding of it. Is that true? Like what else is involved in implementing?
Well, the two areas, the funding and the board appointments. And to also educate the viewers, as we're working those various months with the city law department, who are providing counsel to myself and others working legislation, they stated that under the economic development finance law, that the mayor had to make the appointments for the initial board, which is a corporate board. That their reading of the economic development finance law was that the mayor has to have the power to make the appointments to the corporate board, and the corporate board would then appoint the policy board for this new entity. So another conversation that has been raised by some is, do we amend the legislation to change the appointment process, to have the appointments come from members of city council or other type of measures, so that way you take this lack of implementation regarding the board off the table, and then the other implementation barrier is the funding. And as I stated earlier, in reference to the appropriations committee process, there may be a vehicle to do that. And I think that's also part of the conversations and discussions that that this coalition and others have regarding next steps.
Okay, and I heard you about the appropriations. That sounds like it's a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
If we could remove the barrier about, okay, we can just have another way of appointing the board, maybe some other way. Could you just go out to the foundation market to get financing for this? Is that reasonable, or we kind of have to depend on
you could always do that, but from a foundation perspective, they're going to want to know, okay, is this organization up and running with the board, the bylaws, all of the we'll want to see all the necessary legal documents that make this a viable entity.
Got it.
So the idea of doing an amendment to the legislation to change the appointment power is another idea that has been discussed regarding this initiative.
Okay. All right, thank you for that. Peter, I'll send it back to you. I know we've got about 5 more minutes maybe.
Well, Councilman Green, maybe you could just give us your feeling about where things stand and how optimistic you are about the success of the financial authority and the project going forward.
I think we've made a lot of great strides dealing with a very complex regulatory framework here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I've been able to provide guidance to other cities who are also looking to do public banking in their jurisdictions, but we still have more work to do. We know that there's a challenge from the administration in reference to funding, and we've got to work through that challenge. And then we also have to, in addition to working through the funding challenge, we have to work through the appointment of the board so that it can be in operation. But as I stated in my earlier comments, I think there are some strategies that we can look to do that. And I think ultimately, like with many other ventures, you have to continue to put in the work. Even when you think the work has subsided, you sometimes still have to persevere on. And when you think about, things that are very challenging, complex, they didn't get done overnight. Many of those issues have not been addressed because of the complexity of those challenges. But I think the work that's done here demonstrates that even with very complex challenges, people can be creative in coming up with new ideas and new vehicles like the Philadelphia Public Financial Authority, in spite of the obstacles that some will throw up as roadblocks, but we can need to push forward and persevere in order to bring about this type of entity to benefit citizens of the city of Philadelphia.
Yeah. Peter, speak up if you have more, but I think in the last couple of minutes, I know that you and the coalition members have gotten lots of media calls about this from around the country. What sort of questions are they asking? And for those who are on their own paths, how are they doing? And what's been sort of the response and what are they excited about?
Well, when I think about the various calls we received from jurisdictions around not only around the Commonwealth, but around the country, often it has been, well, how did you get your first step? How did you get started in this work? How can we get to where you are? And I often try to say that, every jurisdiction is different. You may have different roadblocks, different opportunities than you may have in another part of the country. So you have to understand the landscape that you're in, and that's going to direct to some degree and actually more accurately dictate the methodology you'll need to take in order to move forward with the legislation.
Okay. Are there any cities that are at where we are, have made it to a sort of a stage where we are?
Well, I think it's San Fran, and I know we had the chair of the Board of Supervisors, Shaman Walton, on this show. I think they are moving in a slightly different direction, but moving nonetheless, where they are putting together a business plan for the public bank and focus on that operational side, where we focus more on the legal entity legislative side of the creation of this entity. But that's one that comes to mind that has been discussing this issue and been making progress, but still having challenges, like we have challenges, but challenges from a different perspective.
There you go. There you go. Peter, anything more from you? We've got a couple more minutes.
Well, I agree with you, Councilman Green, that Philadelphia has been in the lead. It's really been in the vanguard of the public banking movement for the nation, even though there's been a lot of progress in California in particular, where municipal banks are not only allowed, but they're really encouraged by law, encouragement for 10 cities and or jurisdictions in California to set up their own municipal public banks. But we don't have that luxury in the state of Pennsylvania. We don't have that kind of support at the state level. But we have been in the lead, and a lot of places have been looking to us as a model. That includes New York and Massachusetts. There's a very active program that Governor Murphy has been promoting in New Jersey. So we really have a responsibility to the movement as well as to the people of Philadelphia to make progress and not stall in our movement forward. And I can report to you, Councilman Green, that the morale of the Philadelphia Public Banking Coalition is high, and that we are intent on continuing to move forward, irrespective of the mayor's recalcitrance.
Well, definitely appreciate that support and that commitment to persevere, which is so important as we're dealing with such challenging issues in our society, from gun violence, education, homelessness, opioid addiction. It's going to take a commitment to address those issues, but we did not get into this state overnight, and we will not resolve it overnight. It's going to take time, dedication, and perseverance.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. I think, Peter, maybe another way to summarize is the coalition will continue in partnership with Councilmember Derek Green to sponsor this monthly discussion, right? So we'll continue talking and giving you updates. All right, let's move to a brief goodbye from Councilmember Green, and we'll see you next month. Councilmember Green.
So it's been a pleasure to be on these various calls over, I think this is our 18th episode, 18th or 19th episode. It's hard to believe that time has gone by through, before, and during, and still the remnants of a pandemic. But it's been a pleasure to work with all of you, and the work continues.